They say the worst betrayals are the ones you never see coming. I used to think that was just some line people said in movies. But now I know it's the truest thing I've ever heard. Lily and I had been together for almost a decade, and in my mind, it was a good marriage. Not the fairy tale kind. They don't tell you that fairy tales get old after a while. No, what we had was something sturdier, I thought, something built to last. The kind of life where the highs might not make it to a blockbuster romance, but you could rely on the warmth that settled into the everyday moments. It was the little things. Morning coffee at the same round kitchen table we'd found on sale in our first year together. Sunday afternoon drives, just because. The way she'd laugh when I stumbled over the punchline of a joke, knowing full well I was hopeless at timing. All of it was woven into a pattern that felt safe, familiar, and utterly ours. The truth is, I didn't notice the cracks. Or maybe I did, but I chose not to. A missed kiss goodbye on her way to work, the way her gaze would drift past me when I was talking, as if her mind was somewhere I couldn't follow. I told myself it was normal. People change, they get tired, they have rough patches. Marriage wasn't supposed to be smooth sailing all the time. We were both just busy. But that's the thing about small cracks. They're easier to ignore, easy to paint over until they blend in. You learn to step around them, to make excuses, until you're practically tripping over them and don't even realize it. The first time I felt a true shift, something I couldn't write off, was about 3 months ago. Lily came home from work late. Not the kind of late where you can picture the traffic she's in, or assume she's tied up with something at the office. This was the kind of late that didn't make sense. I sat at the kitchen table, feeling stupid as I checked my phone for a message I knew wasn't there. Her dinner had gone cold on her plate, and my mind was spinning with a cocktail of worry and anger. When she finally walked in, she looked happy. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly windblown, as if she'd been out somewhere. The thought barely had time to settle before she flashed me a half-hearted smile, like I was a friendly stranger she'd run into. I remember thinking that her eyes looked brighter than they had in weeks, and I was torn between the relief that she looked more like herself and the sharp, gnawing question of what or who had put that look on her face. "I thought you were working late," I said, my voice calm, but the edges a bit too sharp. She blinked, as if she'd forgotten I'd be waiting. "I was, but then I grabbed a drink with some colleagues. Sorry, I should have texted." She kissed me on the cheek, barely a brush, and disappeared down the hall. I could hear her hum a little tune as she changed out of her work clothes, her voice light and carefree. Maybe it was the way she didn't sound guilty. Maybe it was the way she didn't look at me like a man she'd missed. Whatever it was, that night planted a tiny seed of doubt, one that I tamped down with everything I had. I had to trust her. That's what you do in a marriage. You trust. You give your partner the benefit of the doubt, even when your gut's whispering something you don't want to hear. The whispers got louder after that. A week later, I found myself glancing at her phone more often. She'd started keeping it close, tucking it into her pocket, or leaving it in her bag when she used to leave it on the table, charging or abandoned somewhere. She was private suddenly, in a way she'd never been. I could still remember the days when she'd hand me her phone to find a picture or to check the weather. Now, I had to wonder what she was hiding. One night, when I reached for her hand in bed, she flinched. It was barely noticeable, maybe just the result of a long day, but that tiny pull away felt like a punch to the chest. I asked her if she was okay, if there was something going on, but she just smiled, soft and sad, and said, "I'm fine, Ryan. Just tired." Tired. It felt like the word had become a mask, a thin layer of paint over something I couldn't see. Every night she was tired. Every conversation seemed to drift into silence. She wasn't unhappy, not really. She wasn't mean or cold, but there was a distance, a thin veil between us, and no matter how I tried, I couldn't find a way around it. I wanted to believe in us. I kept going over the memories, the nights we stayed up late talking, the days we spent doing nothing but laughing over burnt pancakes on a Saturday morning. Those memories were real, weren't they? They had to mean something, to hold us together. I told myself it was a phase, a shadow we could shake off. But in the quiet hours, when I lay awake and she turned her back to me, I felt the weight of something I didn't want to admit. I was losing her, inch by inch, like sand slipping through my fingers. I couldn't bring myself to ask, though. The fear of what she might say was worse than the uncertainty. So, I stayed silent. I kept hoping, kept trusting, kept praying that whatever was wrong would fix itself, that one day I'd wake up and the woman beside me would be the Lily I'd fallen in love with. And that's the thing that hurts most, looking back. Because I didn't see it coming. Not really. The signs were there, sure, but I refused to believe them. Even when the evidence piled up, even when the feeling in my gut turned from a whisper into a scream, I stayed in that place of denial. They say love is blind, but I think it's something worse. I think love makes you willingly close your eyes, hoping that if you pretend not to see, the darkness will just disappear. As I sit here now, staring at the empty side of the bed, I wonder if I could have saved us, if I'd asked her the questions that burned on the tip of my tongue, if I'd looked her in the eye and told her I knew. Maybe it wouldn't have made a difference. Maybe some things are beyond saving. But as I sit here, alone, I can't help but wonder if I was just too late to see the truth. It wasn't one thing. It was a series of things, each one a little whisper that added up to a shout. I just wasn't ready to listen. 2 weeks after that night, she came home late. Lily got a new perfume. She spritzed it on in the bathroom, and the smell wafted into the hall, soft and floral, unfamiliar. It was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. Lily had never been one for perfumes. She'd always said the smell of her shampoo was good enough. She walked out of the bathroom, still pinning up her hair, and I tried to ignore the way it knotted my stomach. "That's new," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Her fingers paused, just for a second, then resumed. "It's nice, isn't it? Thought I'd try something different." She shrugged, almost too casual. "Yeah, it's just not really your thing." She shot me a look, one of those half smiles that somehow cut deeper than any glare. "People change, Ryan. Or do you think I should still smell like college?" Her words hung there, a little too pointed, and I felt myself shrink back. I told myself I was overreacting. People change. Sure, that didn't mean anything was wrong. But that nagging doubt had started to claw at me, and I couldn't shake it. Then came the phone calls. It was a Wednesday evening, one of those gray, overcast days where the world feels thick and quiet. Lily was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she chopped vegetables. I was on the couch, pretending to read a book, though I hadn't turned a page in 15 minutes. I was watching her, the way she moved, the way her shoulders seemed lighter, looser, as if she was walking around in a world separate from mine. Her phone buzzed, a muted little vibration that I barely noticed, until I saw her reaction. She froze, her hand hovering over the chopping board, and glanced quickly over her shoulder, thinking I wasn't watching. She picked up her phone, turned her back, and murmured something I couldn't make out. But there was something in her voice, something soft, careful, almost tender. I could feel my heart rate spike, like my body knew something before my mind had caught up. "Everything okay?" I asked, louder than I'd intended. She jumped, clutching the phone to her chest, her face an unreadable mask. "It's just work," she stammered. "Some late meeting they're rescheduling." "Right. Work." I forced a smile, nodding, but I could tell I'd thrown her off balance. She quickly slipped her phone into her back pocket and went back to chopping with a bit too much focus. It was then I felt something cold, something sharp, sink into me, a seed of suspicion that I couldn't bury. Her explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd been ready for this moment, knowing I'd eventually notice. But I told myself again that it was nothing. We were both under stress. I went back to my book, determined to ignore the way her shoulders stayed tense, her movements a little too precise, as if she were trying too hard to act normal. That weekend, things took another strange turn. I was supposed to meet an old friend for lunch, but he canceled last minute. Lily had told me she'd be out too, something vague about errands. But as I parked my car in the driveway, I noticed another car pulling out from the curb just down the street. I didn't recognize it, but there was something familiar about the figure in the driver's seat. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But as they drove past, the tinted windows obscured their face. I could have sworn I saw a flash of her hair, Lily's unmistakable chestnut waves. My heart stumbled. I wanted to believe I was wrong. My mind scrambled for some reasonable explanation, but everyone felt flimsy, like trying to catch smoke in my hands. I didn't bring it up when she got home. She came in a little too cheerful, humming some pop song, and kissed my cheek without meeting my eyes. I forced myself to ignore it, to not ask. But that night, as we lay in bed, I could feel the weight of all the things we weren't saying pressing down on me, squeezing the air out of the room. I wanted to reach over, to ask her what was really going on, but I was afraid of what she might say. 2 nights later, I found something I couldn't ignore. It was almost midnight. Lily had gone to bed an hour ago, and I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the knot in my chest. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Maybe I was just tired of the nagging questions. But I reached for her phone, which she'd left on the counter, something she never did anymore. I told myself I was being paranoid. Just a quick look, I reasoned. I'd open it, see nothing, and go to bed with my mind a little quieter. But when I swiped up, her phone opened without a passcode, something I hadn't expected. It was like she hadn't planned for me to find it, hadn't thought I'd ever look. I scanned through her messages, my hands clammy, my heart pounding. Most of it was work-related, friends, mundane, until I found a conversation under the name N. At first, it was nothing, a few inside jokes, random comments. Then I scrolled further, and my stomach dropped. The words on the screen blurred as I read messages filled with little phrases that shouldn't have been there, words that felt too close, too personal. I could feel my pulse in my ears, a roaring disbelief that made the room tilt. "Miss you already? Can't wait for Friday. I haven't felt this way in so long." I sat there, frozen, the words searing into my mind, each one a wound I hadn't known I could feel. I heard a creak in the hallway and snapped the phone shut, sliding it back on the counter, my pulse racing. Lily's silhouette appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Ryan, what are you doing up?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. I forced a smile, my hands stuffed into my pockets, to keep them from shaking. Just couldn't sleep. She lingered, her gaze sliding to the phone for a split second. But then she nodded, yawned, and disappeared back into the bedroom. I stood there in the dark, staring at that phone. The words burned into my mind like a scar. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up. She left a note on the table, something light and cheerful about a work meeting and how she'd be back late. I stared at her neat handwriting, so familiar, yet now tainted, twisted by the things I'd seen, the secrets that were starting to unravel before my eyes. Every instinct in me screamed to confront her, to tear down whatever facade she was hiding behind. But fear held me back. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss I didn't want to fall into. I wasn't ready for the truth. Not yet. As the day wore on, I went through her words from the night before, each phrase slicing through me, carving out the space where trust had once been. I replayed every moment, every late night, every awkward glance, piecing together fragments of a story I didn't want to know. Then, that evening, she walked in, her eyes bright, her cheeks flushed. She looked happier than she'd been in months, and in that moment, I knew. Revenge is a strange thing. You think it'll bring satisfaction, justice, maybe even a little peace. But in the end, it's just another form of poison. You swallow it, hoping it'll kill the hurt, but all it does is burn you from the inside out. After those first few days of suspicion, after finding the texts, I'd thought that was the peak of my pain. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. Knowing the truth wasn't enough. It sat inside me like a splinter, a wound that only grew more inflamed with each heartbeat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together. My Lily, smiling that easy smile at him, laughing, looking at him in ways she hadn't looked at me in years. My mind became a reel of images I couldn't shut off, running every possible scenario, every moment she might have spent with him. I was haunted by thoughts of her touching him, of her sharing the pieces of herself that used to be mine. Those thoughts took root, twisting my anger into something darker. And suddenly, revenge didn't just feel like an option, it felt necessary. I spent the next day watching the minutes crawl by at work, waiting until I could leave without raising suspicion. I needed more information before I could do anything, needed to know what exactly I was dealing with. That evening, while Lily was out, another late night, some networking event, she'd told me, I found her laptop in our office. At first, I felt a pang of guilt, a voice whispering that I was stooping to a level I'd regret. But that thought was gone as quickly as it came. She'd thrown away our trust the minute she'd started lying to me. I told myself I deserved to know everything. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There was a folder on her desktop, innocuously labeled Work Files, and when I clicked on it, my stomach twisted. There were photos, emails, chat histories, dozens of files chronicling the life she'd been living right under my nose. The evidence was overwhelming. She wasn't even hiding it. Not really. In her mind, I probably would never look. The emails were the worst part. They were long, detailed, and raw, filled with the kind of conversations we hadn't had in years. Reading her words felt like I was invading a private world that used to be mine. And in that moment, all the memories of our life together felt tainted, like they'd been erased by the words on the screen. "You make me feel so alive," one message read. "I can't remember the last time I felt this way." My hands shook as I read, each sentence a new cut, each confession another wound. She'd told him things she never told me, secrets I thought were ours. I couldn't bring myself to read more. Instead, I saved everything to a flash drive, tucking it into my pocket with a sense of grim satisfaction. I knew then that she'd given me everything I needed. The next day, I called in sick, lying to my boss as smoothly as Lily must have lied to me. I drove to a small cafe on the other side of town, a place I knew she'd never go. I needed a quiet space to think, a place where I could piece together a plan without distraction. I took out my laptop, inserted the flash drive, and opened the files. One by one, I went through the messages, saving screenshots, compiling them neatly into a single, damning document. I read the details of their conversations with a steady, focused rage, every word cementing my resolve. By the time I was done, I had enough evidence to make sure both their lives unraveled the way mine had. That evening, I went to Claire's house. I'd looked her up online, found out where she worked, where she lived, even her phone number. I don't know what I expected to feel, but as I approached her front door, a strange sense of dread washed over me. This wasn't just a matter of exposing Lily and Nathan. This was about taking control, reclaiming something they'd stolen from me. And if that meant bringing someone else into the pain, so be it. I rang the doorbell, my pulse pounding, my hand cold as I held the flash drive with the evidence. Claire opened the door, her expression turning cautious when she saw me standing there, a stranger at her doorstep. "Yes?" she asked, her brow furrowing. I took a breath, steadying myself. "I'm Ryan. I think we need to talk about Nathan." Her eyes widened, and I saw the flicker of realization, the sudden crack in her composure. I handed her the flash drive, telling her it contained everything she needed to know. She looked down at it, then back up at me, her expression shifting from shock to something harder, something more resigned. We didn't talk much. I told her enough, let her know what I'd found. She asked a few questions, her voice steady, but I could see the pain there, the betrayal, and I recognized it because it mirrored my own. We sat in silence for a moment, two strangers who understood each other better than anyone else in the world in that instant. Finally, she thanked me, her voice barely above a whisper, and I left, the weight of what I'd done settling over me. When I got home that night, I sat in the living room, waiting. Lily wasn't supposed to be back for another hour, but I'd already planned how this would go. I'd rehearsed the words I wanted to say, bracing myself for every possible reaction. She walked in with a cheerful smile, her eyes bright, as if she'd come back from a night of catching up with old friends. But when she saw me sitting there, her smile faltered. I knew she sensed something was wrong. "Ryan, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. I didn't answer. I held up my phone, showing her the messages, the pictures I'd saved. Her eyes went wide, and I watched as the color drained from her face, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for words that wouldn't come. "I know everything," I said, my voice cold, steady. "Every lie, every excuse. And just so you know, so does Nathan's wife." Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, shame, guilt. Maybe all three. She started to speak, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," I said. "Just don't. I've listened to your lies long enough. I'm done." She tried to explain, to stammer out apologies and excuses, but they fell flat. Her words felt hollow, empty, and each one only deepened my sense of betrayal. I told her to leave, my voice shaking with barely restrained fury. She started to cry then, the kind of desperate, ugly sobbing I'd never seen from her before. But I couldn't bring myself to care. Her tears felt meaningless, a last-ditch effort to cling to the life she'd destroyed. Eventually she left, and the house fell silent, the emptiness settling over me like a heavy blanket. I sat there for hours, replaying everything, wondering if any of it was real, if any of it had meant anything at all. In the days that followed, the reality of what I'd done began to sink in. At first, I felt a grim satisfaction, knowing I'd exposed her, knowing I'd forced her to face the consequences of her choices. But as the adrenaline faded, something else settled in. A hollow, aching emptiness I couldn't shake. Revenge hadn't brought me peace. It had only intensified the pain, adding a layer of bitterness to the betrayal. I'd thought that seeing her suffer would make things easier, but instead, it felt like I'd dragged myself through the same fire I'd wanted her to burn in. I thought of Claire often, wondered how she was coping, whether she'd confronted Nathan or if she'd chosen to walk away quietly. I thought of the night I'd told her, the way her face had crumpled, the shock giving way to hurt. I thought of how, in that moment, I'd seen a reflection of myself, a brokenness I hadn't wanted to face. Maybe, in a strange way, telling Claire had been more for me than it was for her. Maybe I'd just wanted someone else to share the pain, to understand the depth of the betrayal. But whatever satisfaction I'd found in revenge had been fleeting, leaving me with a kind of emptiness I hadn't expected. In the end, revenge didn't heal anything. It only pulled me further into the darkness, a reminder of everything I'd lost. And as I sat alone in that quiet house, I realized that even though I'd hurt her, even though I'd shattered the life we'd built, it hadn't made me whole again. All it had done was leave me with more scars, more reminders of a love that was gone. In the quiet hours of the night, when I was alone with my thoughts, I understood that there was no satisfaction, no closure, only the cold, aching truth that our life together was over. And that was a kind of emptiness no revenge could fill. The first few days after I kicked Lily out, I expected the pain to settle, like a storm passing over. I waited for the hurt to turn into anger, for the anger to burn itself out, and finally, for peace to settle in. But each day felt emptier than the last, and with every silent night, the questions that haunted me only grew louder. Then, a message came, a simple notification, but it stopped me cold. It was from Claire. "Can we meet?" the message read. "I found something." My pulse quickened. I hadn't heard from her since the night I'd handed her the flash drive. I'd expected she would confront Nathan and move on, much like I was trying to do. But her message felt heavy, urgent, as if there was more to uncover. I stared at the words, my mind racing with possibilities. What had she found? Had Lily and Nathan's betrayal run deeper than either of us realized? After a moment, I replied, agreeing to meet her at a small cafe near her office. When I arrived, Claire was already seated, her face pale, eyes rimmed red, as if she hadn't slept in days. She looked up at me with a mixture of exhaustion and something else, a hardened, steely determination. She wasted no time on pleasantries, sliding a small folder across the table to me. I glanced down, my stomach twisting as I opened it and began to read. They were more messages, but this time, they weren't just between Lily and Nathan. They were emails and texts between other people, friends, colleagues, even strangers. "You two seem to be getting along great. Just make sure to keep your stories straight." "So does Ryan know anything yet?" "Good luck tomorrow. Just remember, no one can find out." The words blurred in front of me as I processed them, each message a new layer of betrayal, a deeper cut. Lily and Nathan hadn't just been hiding their affair. They'd been planning something, talking to others, roping people in to cover for them. Friends who had smiled at me at barbecues, colleagues who I'd thought were strangers. All of them had known. "This isn't just an affair," Claire murmured, her voice a strained whisper. "They've been lying to everyone." I could feel my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the folder, unable to look away from the words in front of me. My mind scrambled to make sense of it, to understand why they would go to such lengths. Had they wanted something from me? From Claire? Or had it all just been a twisted game? That night, I went home, my mind racing with everything Claire had shown me. The idea of betrayal had been hard enough to swallow. But this was something else. It felt like the world had tilted, like the foundation of my life had been torn apart piece by piece. And now, everything was slipping away. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, reading through the messages over and over, dissecting every line, every word, hoping for a clue that would make it all make sense. But the more I read, the less I understood. Lily and Nathan had built a web of lies so intricate, so carefully woven, that I began to wonder if I'd ever known her at all. In the early hours of the morning, I felt my resolve harden. I couldn't just sit here, drowning in questions. I needed answers. There had to be someone else who knew more, someone who could tell me why Lily and Nathan had gone to such lengths to keep their relationship hidden. And as I scrolled through the names mentioned in the messages, one name stood out. Tom, a mutual friend of ours, someone who'd been there from the beginning. The next day, I called Tom, keeping my voice steady as I asked him to meet me. He sounded surprised, hesitant even, but he agreed. When we met at a quiet bar on the edge of town, he looked nervous, like he already knew what was coming. "Ryan," he began, but I cut him off, my voice colder than I'd intended. "Save it. I know about Lily and Nathan. I know you were covering for them. I just want to know why." He paled, glancing around the bar as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. When he finally looked back at me, his face was twisted with guilt. "It's complicated," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I clenched my jaw, the frustration boiling inside me. "Make it simple, then." He took a shaky breath, then finally spoke. They weren't just having an affair, Ryan. It started as that, sure. But then it became something else. Nathan got into some trouble a while back. Financial trouble. Big debts, people after him. And Lily, well, she helped him. They both roped people in to help cover it up. I only found out later, but by then, it was too late. "Helped him?" I echoed, disbelief lacing my words. "How?" He looked down, shame evident on his face. She started shifting money around, small amounts at first, then larger sums. She knew your accounts, Ryan. They thought they could take a bit here, a bit there, and make it up before you noticed. The words hit me like a slap. All this time, I'd thought it was just an affair, a betrayal of love. But they'd been using me, stealing from me. My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of it, but nothing fit. Nothing could justify this level of deceit. That night, I went home and opened my bank account, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the recent transactions. I hadn't been checking closely in months, trusting that Lily handled the finances, as she always had. But now, as I looked through the charges, I saw the pattern. Small withdrawals, disguised as bills or business expenses, but they added up. They added up to thousands. I felt sick, a cold sweat breaking over me as I realized just how deeply this betrayal ran. It wasn't just a broken marriage. Lily and Nathan had conspired to ruin me, to drain me of everything I'd worked for, everything we'd built. As I sat there, staring at the screen, a new kind of rage washed over me. A cold, calculating fury that went beyond anything I'd felt before. They hadn't just taken my trust. They'd taken my security, my stability, the life I'd thought we'd built together. And I knew, in that moment, that I couldn't let them get away with it. I had a choice. Go to the police, expose everything, or take matters into my own hands. But as I thought of the tangled web they'd woven, the lies they'd told, I knew that simply turning them in wouldn't be enough. They'd hurt me in ways I hadn't even realized, pulling me into a game I hadn't agreed to play. And now, it was my turn to take control. I opened my laptop, the cursor blinking on a blank document. It was time to plan, really plan. I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. Whatever it took, I would make sure they paid for what they'd done. Not just Lily and Nathan, but everyone who'd helped them, everyone who'd lied to my face, all the people who'd stood by while they dismantled my life. I was done being the victim. In the days that followed, I pieced together every shred of information I could find, connecting dots, creating a timeline. I called in favors, did quiet research, learning about Nathan's debts, the people he owed, the schemes he'd been running to try to make a quick buck. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized that Nathan was in deeper than even Lily knew. He was desperate, scrambling for money to cover his tracks, and Lily had become just another pawn in his game. She'd been blinded by whatever she thought they had, and now she was entangled in his mess, just as I had been entangled in hers. But this time, I wasn't going to stand by and let them pull me down with them. I made calls, sent messages, whispered the truth into the ears of the people Nathan had been hiding from. I leaked just enough to ensure that his web of lies would start to fray, that the people he'd wronged would come looking. And then I waited. Each night I lay awake, knowing that the storm was coming, knowing that I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. And as the days passed, I watched the first cracks begin to show. Nathan's sudden absences, the frantic phone calls from Lily, the whispers among friends who were beginning to piece together what had happened. It was all unraveling. The life they'd built on lies, finally collapsing under the weight of the truth. And for the first time since it all began, I felt something close to peace. Because now, they were the ones living in fear, watching as the life they'd tried to steal slipped through their fingers, knowing that there was no way out.